What is revealed here is not just a warning about one nation, but a much wider spiritual pattern that unfolds across history. The message begins with a striking claim. From the late 19th century, and especially into the mid-20th century, a profound moral collapse would begin to take shape in parts of the world, including Ecuador. According to this warning, passions would rise uncontrollably, leading to a breakdown of moral order and a deep corruption of customs. The text describes a situation where evil would not act openly at first, but would work through hidden influence, gradually reshaping society from within. It is said that in this environment, Satan would gain a strong influence through organized structures, often described as Masonic sects in the language of the message. The focus of this corruption, according to the prophecy, would not be random but strategic. Children would be targeted in order to weaken the moral foundation of future generations. The idea presented is that if innocence is corrupted early, the entire spiritual structure of society becomes easier to destabilize over time. The message then expands beyond Ecuador, expressing sorrow over what is described as widespread sacrilege against sacred things. One of the most serious claims is that consecrated hosts would be stolen from churches and desecrated. In this vision, what is considered most holy in Catholic belief would be treated with extreme disrespect, even trampled upon. This is presented not as symbolic language alone, but as a direct spiritual attack against the Eucharist, which holds central importance in Catholic theology. Another major concern raised is the weakening of sacramental life, especially the sacrament of the sick, often called extreme unction. The warning suggests that many people would begin to ignore or undervalue it. In real-life practice, this is reflected in situations where families delay or refuse the sacrament for dying relatives, often out of misplaced optimism or misunderstanding. Instead of seeking spiritual preparation for death, people may assume that everything is already fine, even when someone is critically ill. This is presented as a serious spiritual loss, where souls are deprived of grace at the most important moment of transition. The message continues by describing how some deaths would occur without the sacraments, either due to neglect or resistance within society. It even suggests that some of this would be allowed as part of divine justice. The underlying theme is that rejection of sacred practices leads to spiritual consequences that are not always visible in the moment but carry eternal significance. From here, the focus shifts to marriage, which is described as a sacred institution, symbolizing the union between Christ and the Church. The warning claims that this sacrament would be heavily attacked and redefined in society. It speaks of laws and cultural changes that would weaken marriage and encourage sinful living arrangements, making moral disorder seem normal or even acceptable. This prediction is often compared to modern statistics about relationships and family life. In many societies today, a significant percentage of children are born outside of marriage, and cohabitation before marriage has become widely accepted. Surveys show that a large majority of couples now live together before marriage, often without religious commitment. This reflects a major cultural shift where traditional sacramental understanding of marriage is no longer the dominant framework in society. The message then moves to the sacrament of holy orders, warning that priests would be mocked, attacked, and spiritually pressured. Because priests represent Christ in Catholic theology, any corruption or scandal within the clergy is seen as a direct wound to the Church itself. The text suggests that many priests would be drawn away from their vocation through temptation, confusion, or moral failure, leading to scandal that affects the entire Christian community. This is connected to the reality that many faithful today feel distrust or pain due to past scandals within the Church. Even good and faithful priests often suffer from suspicion and general judgment because of the actions of others. The emotional and spiritual burden placed on sincere clergy is described as part of this wider crisis, where the reputation of the Church becomes deeply wounded. The warning also describes a period of spiritual dryness and moral confusion, where even leadership within the Church would experience deep sorrow and isolation. It paints a picture of a time when guidance becomes difficult, and many people feel spiritually lost or uncertain about truth and direction. Another theme introduced is the rise of luxury, understood in a moral sense, particularly linked to lust and excessive indulgence. The message suggests that temptation would become normalized, especially in matters of purity and sexuality. It warns that many souls would be lost not through dramatic rebellion, but through gradual acceptance of moral compromise. This idea is reinforced with the claim that sins of the flesh would become one of the most common causes of spiritual downfall. It emphasizes that innocence, especially in children, would become increasingly rare, and modesty in society would decline. These statements are presented as spiritual observations about cultural change rather than isolated moral commentary. Historical references are also introduced, including earlier church statements about modesty and behavior. Traditional teachings emphasized strict standards of modest dress and conduct, which over time have become less common in modern culture. The contrast between past expectations and present norms is used to highlight how much social attitudes have shifted. The message continues by describing society as being flooded with immoral influences, compared to an overwhelming tide that spreads through public spaces, media, and education. The idea is that corruption would not remain private, but would become widespread and visible in everyday life. There is also a strong claim that virginity and innocence would become increasingly rare. Earlier prophecies attributed to various Marian apparitions are referenced to support the idea that moral purity would decline significantly over time. This is presented as part of a broader pattern of spiritual weakening across generations. The condition of the clergy is again addressed with severe language, describing moral failure among some priests in historical writings. These references are used to show that concerns about clerical weakness are not new, but have existed for centuries in different forms. The message argues that such issues became more visible in modern times due to cultural and institutional shifts. A key historical reference is made to internal church documents from the mid-20th century that reportedly addressed serious concerns about unsuitable candidates for priesthood. This is used to argue that moral and disciplinary problems within religious institutions predated later public crises rather than appearing suddenly. The final idea presented is a warning about bad leadership within the church being one of the most severe forms of spiritual suffering for any society. The presence of weak or corrupt spiritual guidance is described as a deeper problem than external persecution because it affects the spiritual direction of entire communities. Finally, reference is made to later private revelations suggesting internal conflict within the church itself, including disagreements among bishops and cardinals. This is presented as a continuation of the broader theme that spiritual crisis does not only come from outside forces, but can also arise from internal division and confusion. The message continues by moving beyond isolated warnings and into a broader vision of spiritual decline that appears not sudden, but gradual and deeply structured. It describes a time in which the foundations of religious life would be weakened not by open destruction alone, but by internal confusion, shifting priorities, and a loss of clarity about what is sacred. The concern is not only about individual sin, but about entire systems slowly losing their spiritual identity over time. Within this framework, the church is portrayed as entering a period where external appearance may remain, but internal strength begins to fade in certain areas. Rituals may still exist, structures may still function, yet the spiritual understanding behind them becomes less clear for many people. This creates a gap between form and meaning, where religious practices continue outwardly but lose depth in how they are understood and lived. A central theme in this warning is the gradual weakening of moral awareness across society. It is suggested that behaviors once clearly recognized as sinful would increasingly be seen as normal, acceptable, or even desirable. This shift does not happen instantly, but through repeated exposure, cultural reinforcement, and the slow reshaping of conscience over generations. What was once considered spiritually dangerous becomes, over time, socially ordinary. This transformation is especially evident in how moral teaching is received. Where previous generations may have had a strong sense of right and wrong, shaped by religious formation, later generations often inherit a more fragmented understanding. Moral certainty becomes less common, and personal opinion begins to replace objective standards in many areas of life. The result is a society where moral boundaries are no longer universally recognized, but individually defined. The message emphasizes that this kind of shift is particularly dangerous because it affects the conscience itself. When the sense of moral clarity is weakened, people may no longer recognize certain actions as spiritually harmful. This is not necessarily due to rebellion, but due to gradual formation within a culture that no longer reinforces traditional moral frameworks with consistency. From a spiritual perspective, this is described as one of the most effective forms of deception, not through fear or force, but through confusion. When the mind no longer clearly distinguishes between good and evil, the need for repentance becomes less obvious. And when repentance is weakened, the entire sacramental life begins to lose urgency and meaning. The text also reflects on how this shift affects families and upbringing. Parents, often formed within the same cultural environment, may unintentionally pass on a weakened sense of spiritual responsibility. Children grow up in environments where religious practice may still exist, but is not always deeply understood or consistently applied. As a result, the transmission of faith becomes fragile, dependent more on habit than conviction. In this context, the role of external influence becomes significant. Education systems, media, and cultural messaging are described as powerful forces that shape values over time. When these influences are no longer aligned with traditional moral teaching, they contribute to a gradual redefinition of what is considered acceptable behavior. This does not require overt opposition to religion, but simply a steady shift in priorities and assumptions. The message then returns to the idea of sacramental life, suggesting that as moral awareness weakens, participation in key spiritual practices also declines. Sacraments that require reflection, preparation, and understanding begin to be approached more casually. Over time, this leads to a reduced sense of their spiritual significance, even among those who still identify with the faith. A particularly important point is the connection between moral awareness and spiritual protection. In traditional Catholic understanding, sacraments are not merely symbolic, but channels of grace that strengthen the soul. When they are neglected or misunderstood, individuals become more vulnerable to spiritual confusion and temptation. The warning suggests that this vulnerability increases when entire societies move away from consistent sacramental practice. The narrative also highlights the emotional and psychological consequences of this shift. As moral clarity weakens, individuals may experience internal conflict without understanding its source. Feelings of emptiness, confusion, or unrest may arise when actions and beliefs are no longer aligned with a stable moral framework. This inner fragmentation is described as a natural result of living in contradiction with deeper spiritual truths. At the same time, the message acknowledges that outward stability can still exist. People may continue to work, build families, and participate in society while experiencing internal disconnection from spiritual meaning. This creates a situation where life appears normal on the surface, but lacks deeper coherence at the level of conscience and faith. Another layer of the warning focuses on the increasing difficulty of discernment. When moral categories become unclear, distinguishing truth from error becomes more complex. This affects not only individuals but also communities and institutions, making it harder to maintain unified teaching and consistent practice. The result is fragmentation, where different interpretations coexist without a shared foundation. The text suggests that this fragmentation can extend even into religious environments where differing approaches to moral teaching create confusion among the faithful. When clarity is replaced by ambiguity, individuals are left to navigate complex moral questions without strong guidance. increasing the risk of misunderstanding and spiritual error. Despite the seriousness of these observations, the message does not present them as irreversible. Instead, it implies that awareness itself is a critical step toward restoration. Recognizing the nature of the crisis is framed as the beginning of recovery because it allows individuals to consciously return to clarity, discipline, and spiritual grounding. The underlying tone remains one of warning, but also of responsibility. The idea is that even in times of widespread confusion, personal fidelity to truth remains possible. Individuals are not powerless. They can choose to seek clarity, maintain moral awareness, and remain connected to spiritual practices that preserve integrity of conscience. Ultimately, this part of the message builds toward a deeper understanding of the crisis, not as a single event, but as a long-term transformation of perception, belief, and moral awareness. It sets the stage for a more intense reflection on how such conditions affect both society and the spiritual life of individuals, which continues in the next section. As the message deepens, the focus shifts from cultural decline to something more direct and unsettling: the spiritual forces that operate behind human choices. The warning suggests that what appears as purely social or political change is often influenced by a deeper, invisible struggle. From this perspective, human history is not only shaped by visible events, but also by spiritual movements that affect thought, behavior, and moral perception over long periods of time. The text introduces the idea that certain patterns of corruption are not random, but organized and sustained. These patterns do not always manifest as extreme actions at first. Instead, they often begin with subtle shifts in belief, gradual acceptance of ideas, and slow weakening of spiritual discipline. Over time, these shifts create an environment where moral resistance becomes weaker and harmful influences become more effective. Within this framework, the loss of moral clarity described earlier is not just an intellectual problem, but a spiritual one. When conscience is weakened, the ability to recognize spiritual danger also declines. This creates a condition where individuals may unknowingly open themselves to influences they do not fully understand. The warning presents this as one of the most dangerous aspects of spiritual decline because it operates without obvious signs. The message then emphasizes the role of distraction in this process. Instead of direct confrontation, the influence is described as working through continuous diversion, keeping attention focused on surface-level concerns while deeper spiritual realities are ignored. In such a state, people may remain active, informed, and engaged with the world, yet disconnected from inner reflection and spiritual awareness. A key idea presented is that confusion itself becomes a tool of influence. When moral and spiritual truths are no longer clearly understood, individuals become easier to mislead, not necessarily through lies that are obvious, but through partial truths mixed with distortion. This creates a landscape where distinguishing between truth and error requires greater effort, discipline, and formation. The message also connects this condition to the weakening of spiritual protection. In traditional Catholic understanding, grace strengthens the soul and provides a resistance against spiritual harm. When sacramental life is neglected or reduced to habit without understanding, this protective dimension is described as weakened. The warning suggests that this does not happen all at once, but gradually, as spiritual practices lose their central place in daily life. Another important theme is the role of rationalization. As moral clarity declines, individuals may begin to justify behaviors that were once clearly understood as wrong. These justifications often rely on shifting cultural norms, emotional reasoning, or reinterpretations of moral teaching. Over time, this can lead to a situation where conscience no longer acts as a clear internal guide, but instead becomes shaped by external influence. The text describes this as particularly dangerous because it creates internal inconsistency. A person may still believe they are acting correctly, while their actions gradually move away from objective moral standards. This disconnect between belief and reality can persist for long periods without being fully recognized. especially in environments where accountability and formation are weak. At a broader level, the message suggests that entire societies can experience this same dynamic. When cultural systems no longer reinforce stable moral frameworks, collective understanding of right and wrong becomes fragmented. This fragmentation does not always produce immediate collapse, but it weakens the long-term resilience of moral and spiritual life. The warning also highlights how this environment affects truth itself. In a culture where moral certainty is weakened, truth becomes more difficult to define in a shared way. Competing narratives emerge, each claiming legitimacy, but without a unified foundation to resolve disagreement. This leads to ongoing tension, confusion, and instability in moral reasoning. From a spiritual perspective, this is presented as a condition that requires vigilance. The danger is not only external influence, but internal disorientation. When individuals no longer trust their conscience or lack proper formation, they become more dependent on shifting cultural voices rather than stable moral principles. This dependency increases vulnerability to further confusion. The message also reflects on how this affects spiritual growth. Without clarity, the path toward discipline and virtue becomes harder to recognize. Progress in the spiritual life depends on consistent understanding of moral truth, regular practice, and structured formation. When these elements weaken, spiritual development becomes inconsistent or stalled. At the same time, the warning does not suggest that awareness is lost entirely. Even in periods of confusion, the ability to recognize truth remains present, though it may require greater effort to recover. The emphasis is placed on the importance of formation, reflection, and deliberate choice in maintaining spiritual direction. The narrative suggests that one of the most important responses to this condition is attentiveness. Rather than accepting confusion as normal, individuals are encouraged to recognize it as a signal that something deeper is occurring. This awareness allows for a more intentional approach to moral and spiritual life, even within a complex cultural environment. Ultimately, this section presents a layered understanding of the crisis. It is not only about external events or visible decline, but about the gradual shaping of perception itself. When perception is altered over time, both moral understanding and spiritual sensitivity are affected. This creates a situation where the greatest challenge is not simply knowing what is right, but maintaining the ability to recognize it clearly. This sets the stage for the next part of the message, where the consequences of this spiritual and moral disorientation are examined more directly, along with the urgency of response and restoration. As the message progresses, the focus shifts toward the consequences of this long-term moral and spiritual weakening, especially when it begins to affect institutions that were meant to preserve clarity and guidance. The warning suggests that when confusion enters areas responsible for teaching truth, the impact is multiplied across entire populations. What begins as subtle uncertainty can gradually develop into widespread inconsistency in belief and practice. The text describes a situation in which leadership itself becomes affected by the same cultural and intellectual influences present in society. When those responsible for teaching and guiding others are themselves influenced by ambiguity, the transmission of moral and spiritual clarity becomes more difficult. This creates a ripple effect where confusion is not only present in individuals, but also reflected in the structures meant to provide direction. In this environment, people seeking guidance may encounter differing interpretations of the same teachings, leading to further uncertainty. Instead of a unified voice that reinforces stable moral understanding, there may be variation in emphasis, approach, or interpretation. Over time, this can weaken confidence in spiritual authority and make it harder for individuals to form a consistent moral framework. The message emphasizes that this type of fragmentation does not necessarily come from outright rejection of truth, but from gradual adaptation to external pressures. As cultural expectations shift, institutions may feel compelled to respond in ways that maintain relevance or accessibility. However, this adaptation can sometimes lead to reduced clarity in areas where consistency is essential. A key concern raised in the warning is the effect this has on individuals who are already struggling with moral confusion. When external guidance becomes less clear, internal uncertainty increases. People may find it more difficult to discern which teachings are definitive and which are interpretive, leading to hesitation in making moral decisions. The text also highlights the emotional dimension of this crisis. Many individuals experience a sense of instability when foundational beliefs are no longer clearly reinforced. This can lead to spiritual fatigue, where the effort required to maintain clarity feels increasingly difficult. In such cases, faith may not disappear, but it may become less structured and more vulnerable to influence. Another important point is the distinction between appearance and substance. The message suggests that external structures may remain intact while internal coherence weakens. In other words, institutions can continue to function visibly, while the underlying unity of belief becomes less stable. This creates a situation where outward continuity masks inward fragmentation. The warning also addresses the role of compromise in this process. Compromise is not presented as inherently negative in all contexts, but as potentially dangerous when it involves core moral principles. When foundational truths are adjusted in response to external pressure, even slightly, it can set a precedent for further adjustments over time. This gradual shift can eventually lead to significant differences between original teaching and current practice. From a broader perspective, the message suggests that this dynamic is not limited to one institution or one period in history. It is presented as a recurring pattern that appears whenever moral clarity is weakened and external influence becomes dominant. The specific expressions may change, but the underlying process remains similar. The text also reflects on the impact this has on trust. Trust in spiritual leadership depends heavily on perceived consistency. When consistency is disrupted, even unintentionally, confidence can be weakened. This does not necessarily lead to rejection, but it can create hesitation, uncertainty, and hesitation in following guidance. At the same time, the message acknowledges that within any period of confusion, there remain individuals who continue to preserve clarity and integrity. These individuals often serve as stabilizing influences, maintaining continuity with foundational teachings even when broader environments become unstable. Their presence is presented as essential for preserving continuity across generations. The warning also emphasizes that crisis within institutions often becomes most visible not immediately, but over time. Early signs may appear minor or manageable, but as they accumulate, their combined effect becomes more significant. This gradual development makes it difficult to recognize the full scope of change until it has already progressed substantially. Despite the seriousness of these observations, the message does not present the situation as without remedy. Instead, it suggests that clarity can still be restored through deliberate effort, renewed formation, and a return to foundational principles. The possibility of correction remains present, even in complex circumstances, provided there is willingness to recognize the issue. The underlying theme of this section is responsibility. When confusion increases, the need for personal discernment becomes more important, not less. Individuals are encouraged to seek clarity actively, rather than passively relying on shifting interpretations. This includes deepening understanding, strengthening moral awareness, and maintaining connection with stable sources of guidance. Ultimately, this part of the message presents a sobering but structured view of institutional and cultural fragility. It shows how easily clarity can be weakened when external pressures are allowed to reshape internal understanding. At the same time, it reinforces the idea that awareness and intentionality remain key factors in preserving stability. This leads naturally into the final section, where the focus shifts toward response, resilience, and the path forward in the midst of ongoing uncertainty. In the final movement of this message, the focus turns away from analysis and toward response. After examining moral decline, institutional confusion, and the gradual weakening of clarity, The central question becomes what a person is expected to do in the midst of such conditions. The emphasis is no longer on identifying problems, but on how to remain spiritually and morally stable within them. The message suggests that even in periods of widespread uncertainty, individual responsibility does not diminish. In fact, it becomes more important. When external structures appear inconsistent, the stability of personal conviction must be strengthened. This involves a deliberate commitment to clarity, discipline, and consistency in moral understanding rather than reliance on shifting external interpretations. A key theme in this section is the importance of returning to foundational principles. Instead of seeking novelty or constantly adapting to new interpretations, the emphasis is placed on revisiting what has already been established as consistent and reliable. This creates a sense of continuity that helps resist confusion generated by changing cultural or institutional pressures. The text also highlights the importance of discernment. In times of complexity, not every message, interpretation, or influence carries equal weight. Discernment involves the ability to distinguish between what is stable and what is unstable, what is consistent and what is fluctuating. This requires reflection, study, and a willingness to slow down rather than react impulsively to every new development. Another central idea is the role of personal formation. The message emphasizes that clarity does not arise automatically. It is developed over time through education, reflection, and practice. Individuals are encouraged to deepen their understanding of moral principles so that they are not easily influenced by external ambiguity. Formation becomes a safeguard against confusion. At the same time, the message acknowledges that clarity is not maintained through intellect alone. It also requires discipline in daily life, including consistency in actions, habits, and choices. When belief and behavior align, stability becomes easier to maintain. When they diverge, confusion becomes more likely. The final section also points to the importance of resilience. Resilience here is not presented as emotional toughness alone, but as the ability to remain steady in the face of prolonged uncertainty. This includes accepting that clarity may not always be supported by the surrounding environment, yet choosing to maintain it regardless. There is also an emphasis on community and guidance. While individual responsibility is central, the message recognizes that people are not meant to navigate complexity entirely alone. Seeking reliable guidance, surrounding oneself with clarity-oriented influences, and remaining connected to stable sources of teaching are presented as important supports. The text further explains that periods of confusion often reveal what is truly foundational. When external structures become unstable, what remains consistent in a person's understanding becomes more visible. These moments, while difficult, can serve as opportunities to strengthen what is essential and discard what is secondary. Another important point is the distinction between fear and awareness. Awareness of instability does not require fear-driven thinking. Instead, it calls for measured understanding and intentional response. Fear can lead to paralysis or overreaction, while awareness can lead to clarity and deliberate action. The message also suggests that long-term stability is built through small, consistent choices rather than dramatic actions. Daily decisions, repeated over time, shape the strength of moral and spiritual resilience. This gradual approach is presented as more effective than sudden or extreme responses. Despite the seriousness of the earlier sections, the final tone remains focused on endurance rather than despair. The underlying message is that confusion, while real, is not permanent. It can be addressed through sustained effort, clarity of purpose, and commitment to foundational truth. In conclusion, the message presents a complete arc, from the recognition of widespread moral and institutional confusion to the analysis of its causes, and finally to the response required from individuals within it. The final emphasis is not on collapse, but on continuity, on the ability to remain steady even when external clarity appears weakened. The closing idea is simple but significant. Even in uncertain times, clarity is still possible for those who actively choose to preserve it. Stability is not guaranteed by environment, but by commitment. And in that commitment, the possibility of order remains alive.